It took me some time to figure out how to approach the wildfires raging in Southern California over the past week. I could start by pointing out the obvious. Climate change is driving wildfires worldwide. But at this point, that feels like stating the cliché. We've heard it over and over again. Climate change is fueling fires, from Australia's Black Summer in 2020 to the recent apocalyptic scenes in Hawaii. California in particular seems almost accustomed to wildfires. Some residents joke that whenever they see a haze outside, it probably means something is burning nearby. Another angle would be the technical breakdown many analyses offer. Southern California has been in a prolonged drought. From the summer of 2024 until now, soil moisture in the Los Angeles region has been about 2% of historical levels. And before this dryness, a wet spring in 2024 encouraged lush vegetation growth. That greenery eventually dried out, turning into perfect fuel for wildfires. Add to the Santa Ana winds, those infamous bone-dry gusts that can fan flames and rapidly change fire directions. If you've seen the movie Only the Brave, you've probably have an idea of how devastating these winds can be. And then all it takes is a spark to ignite a whole mountainside. But I feel like there's more to the story. Framing the wildfires as a chain of unfortunate events with climate change as the backdrop makes it sound like bad luck, something we just have to endure until the next, possibly worse scenario comes along. That narrative implies we are powerless, and I'm not convinced we are. So, what more is there to wildfires? I'm Fei Fei, and this is Climate Watch, the podcast where we explore big climate questions with insights from experts and industry insiders. My goal is to help you better understand our planet and inspire action, whether big or small. By the way, I've also launched a newsletter on Substack called Rivers and Mountains. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can find me there too. Now back to the wildfires in Los Angeles. Human factors are also a significant part of the story. More people are living in fire-prone areas, reducing the natural buffer zones between homes and wildlands. Then there are problems like aging power lines, uneven distribution of firefighting resources, and limited water supplies in some regions. Each of these issues could be a podcast episode on its own, and each community faces their unique challenges. It's easy for someone like me, sitting tens of thousands of kilometers away, to comment on these problems, to criticize authorities for their responses, or to blame the wealthy for exploiting their privileges. But ultimately, those are not my story to tell. I'm not on the ground in the US. I can't walk into communities to hear their experiences firsthand. I can offer virtual empathy, but that pales in comparison to the despair of losing a home, or worse, a loved one. So here is what I can do. I can try to understand the changes happening to our planet and what actions people like you and me can take. I can explore what went wrong in situations like this and how we might correct it. To do that, I reached out to Stephen Pyne, an American fire historian who spent over 50 years studying wildfires in the United States. He's also an emeritus professor at Arizona State University and written over 40 books on fires. He joined me from a farm in Arizona. I think it's quite rare for us to see wildfires really threatening urban areas, especially a major city like LA. But then on the other hand, I read a lot of analysis, and many fire experts say it's almost inevitable for us to see wildfires threatening cities, especially big ones. Do you agree with this kind of comment?
Well, yes and no. It used to be during the settlement period in the United States, cities burned regularly. They burned at the same time and in much the same way as the surrounding countryside, because they were made of the same materials. And so we see cities burned and rebuilt. That passes. After the San Francisco fire in 1906 was the last major urban fire in the United States, we understood how finally to eliminate that kind of urban fire. And then it comes back again. It comes back across San Francisco Bay in Oakland in 1991. And this is an urban conflagration. It seemed anomalous, strange, but then we started seeing it over the last 20 years. We have seen more and more of that. And not just in California or in obvious fire-prone areas with high winds. It's been in other areas of California. It has been in Colorado, in grassy areas. It's been in the mountains in the eastern U.S., very different forests, not prone to burn normally. It's been all over. So this is becoming a regular phenomenon now, urban conflagration. It may start on the perimeter of the city, but then it very quickly escalates, and the houses, the structures, then become the primary fuel. And if you look at many of the photos of the devastation scene, you will see often the vegetation survives. The house is incinerated, but the vegetation is still alive. In a sense, the trees are adapted to fire and the houses are not. This is becoming a significant problem for us. And Los Angeles is just, this is like a Category 4 or 5 hurricane in terms of damages.
But California has always been, I think, accustomed in a way to wildfires. It's supposed to have like ready, prepared, and also advanced technologies and protocols when it comes to, contain wildfires. It's also one of the wealthier states in the United States. So I reckon funding would also not be a problem for them. Then why are they still facing challenges for this round of wildfires? Is it because it's getting out of control, the scale of it, or is something wrong with their management system?
Well, all of the above. And first, let me point out it is not just the United States. Australia, Canada, Europe, particularly Mediterranean Europe, are all experiencing these kinds of fires now. And in fact, this kind of fire is now a pathology of modern developed countries. This is something that is happening in wealthy countries, countries with robust science, countries with advanced technology, and are unable increasingly. So part of the problem is that the environmental conditions are getting worse. California is built to burn. It's just its natural constitution. It is going to burn, and it is going to burn explosively from time to time. That is just the character of the mountains and the climate and the winds. And so we have, throughout California's history, particularly in the last, say, 150 years, we see these large fires, and then the response is to build up firefighting capability.
With more people, with more firefighters.
More engines, more airplanes, whatever it takes, and to show that we care, we are taking steps, and then the next fire comes and it overwhelms the capabilities. So we build up more capabilities, and then the next fire overwhelms those. And so we're in this kind of arms race, which we are destined to lose. All of the countries that have had these problems come to the same conclusion, that the solution is to change the landscape, is to modify at a relatively large scale the composition of the landscape, what can burn, how it might spread through that landscape, and so forth. Also to have firefighting capabilities, but unless you control that larger landscape, the fire will overwhelm you. And the climate change and other conditions are in fact creating circumstances that our advanced technology will fail under extreme conditions. But it's exactly those extreme conditions that do all the damage. So we are very effective at suppressing nuisance fires and small stuff and this and that, but when the really catastrophic fire is ready, we can do nothing about it. The solution is to change how we live, the building materials, the arrangement of structures on the land, the surrounding land, whether it is combustible and so forth, this kind of stuff. And nowhere that I have seen in recent years are is a political system willing to do that?
And that's interesting in a way that I think you published the book Pyrocene 5 or 10 years ago, really. I lose track of time. But you kind of predict that the fires will overwhelm our system as humans someday in the future. Does this round of LA fires really reflect the patterns that you predict in the age of fire in the Pyrocene?
Yes, but I see that as essentially a planetary phenomenon. It has gone on for a long time. It is the result of humans and fire, a very old association, as old as our species. We have been interacting and remaking the planet. And when we converted to fossil fuels, the whole process goes on turbochargers. It's accelerating. So I see that we are, in effect, creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. So imagine all the features of an ice age, ice-clad landscapes, changes in sea level, mass extinctions, all the package, but pass it through a kind of fire prism. And what does it look like? It looks like the world that we're seeing now. And so I see this continuing, and the process is accelerating as long as we continue to, until we take fundamental steps to change it.
You think the source, well, basically the beginning of this, the age of fire is starting when we start to burn fossil fuels in a really large scale?
I am exceptional. I conceived the idea, and I think that the entire Holocene, the latest geologic epoch, should be renamed a Pyrocene, because the process begins when a fire-carrying, fire-wielding creature encounters a fire-receptive environment, the warming after the retreat of the last glaciation, and the two begin interacting. And I think we have been able to interact and have made significant changes, even some changes in climate, but there were always limits. And when we started burning fossil fuels, the whole thing changes, and now it's completely out of control. We are replacing the ice age with an age of fire.
Then how should we respond to these new challenges? How should we live in the age of fire?
I see fire influencing and shaping lots of stuff, not just fire directly, but fire indirectly, and the indirect effects that they're causing global warming. So my sense, in a very general way, three things. The problem, we have too much bad fire. Bad fire, fires that destroy cities, kill people, trash ecosystems. We have too little good fire. Good fire actually enhances ecosystems, reduces fuels, allows us to live with fire much easier. And this is what humanity has always done in the past. You change the environment a bit and you use your own fire. It's like tame fire. Instead of having wolves running around, you have sheepdogs. You have domesticated fire. And the third thing is that we have too much combustion, and that's the fossil fuel issue. And we have to shut down the fossil fuel as soon as possible.
Yeah, it sort of reminds us that we used to call fire as the biggest discovery of the humankind. But then when it comes to wildfires, it seems like we're talking about two different fires there. Is that the fires that help us cook food and then the wildfires, but they're essentially the same thing.
And, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in evolutionary terms, the early hominids, we got big heads and small guts because we learned to cook food. So in that sense, fire is a part of our genome. I mean, we cannot exist without fire. Fire can exist without us. It did for 420 million years.
Then how should we increase the portion of good fires in our system and then reduce the portions of bad fires?
That's a great question, and it's one that the United States and Australia in particular have been addressing for, well, probably 60 years or so. Actually, our national policy in the United States early in the 20th century was to eliminate all fires, and to the extent we could do it. And we spent 50 years trying to take all fires out. And then we realized that this was a mistake, that the fuels were increasing, fires were becoming more difficult to contain, but the ecological integrity of these environments was deteriorating because they needed fire to renew it. The right kind of fire is a part of that system. So for both reasons, we began changing national policy between 1968 and 1978. All this happened independently of climate change. This was just a change in how we were using the land, how we were living on it, and what our relationship to fire was. Now, once we have climate change as a serious contributor, well, that globalizes the problem, but it also enhances, it magnifies, it puts energy into it. So now the fires are even more out of control than they were before. Even if we tamed climate, we would still have a fire problem because we have to manage these lands relative to fire. I know that can be a strange concept to people.
Really, yeah.
In some people, and I think China has been cultivated so densely for so long that you have field fires and so forth, but you don't have these kinds of fires. It isn't possible because the old way. But as you convert, it will be interesting to see whether you follow the same pattern that Europe, the United States, Australia, and so forth have, or whether you will be able to learn from our errors. And it's very hard to put fire back in, particularly when people live in an urban environment and they have no personal connection with fire anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like someone like me who's been living in cities my whole life, basically. And fires are just a piece of news for me in the television or over the radio. And my closest encounter with wildfires was in 2020. I was in Sydney and I went through the Black Summer there. And I was able to learn how the Aboriginal people used to deal with the fires, the bushfires, what they call this. And I know they had these strategies as well to burn down a piece of land to stop the wildfire. But then in that case, it apparently didn't work. In the response system that you propose before to live with fire, to allow them to burn in areas, good fires that you mentioned, does that have something to do with, cultures like from Native Americans who probably have also similar practices before to burn down some piece of land in sort of a preparation?
Burning by the native peoples in America was very widespread. And they would frequently burn the forest, not burning down the forest, but they would burn on the surface of the forest. And a lot of this would be grass or leaves or small shrubs. And so the fire was a relatively light burn that was easily controlled. So you do that under conditions where this fire stays that rather than getting into the trees or blowing up. But those traditions were also true in Europe, but they were embedded in an agricultural context. People burned fields, they cleared land with fire, they burned pastures. People living on the land were very familiar with fire and used it. So the problem is really with the elites. The elites in Europe, which got transferred to the U.S. and elsewhere in the colonial context, really distrusted fire. They thought it was messy, it's dangerous, it's not easily controlled. A fire in a stove is fine, a fire in a field, they want to find alternatives for it. The continued burning is regarded as primitive and embarrassing. This is making the country backward. There's that element in it. But when settlers from Europe and Native Americans met, they often traded fires and hybridized fires. And used it very widely. And many of the native practices were picked up by settlers because they were adapted to local conditions better than Europe. Europe would take a time of learning to make that transition. And there were many formal debates a century ago in this country about whether we should follow the native practices and the traditional knowledge of farmers and pastoralists, or whether we should be modern and rational and scientific and eliminate fire and replace it with tamer forms on the land, just as we were doing, replacing fires in our houses with electric bulbs and so forth. And that was a very strong debate. It was in California, very interesting enough. But ultimately, it came down on the side of sort of the European model. They wanted control. There's a very widespread saying, sort of folk saying in Europe that you hear all across historically, that fire makes a good servant, but a bad master. We have to be the master. If fire is the master, we are in trouble. But that defines our relationship to fire as a master servant. And there's that fear of losing control. There are other ways. In some parts, for example, in the U.S., it might be others would consider, well, fire is the best of friends and the worst of enemies. So that's a different relationship. Well, we have an alliance. We work together. We help fire. Fire helps us. It's not that same sense that we have to be in absolute control. The fear, and I think part of it is the fear of losing social control, because many of the people who use fire move around the landscapes with their flocks. They slash and burn for new farming. The European model is kind of a garden where everything has its place and time, and that becomes a social model as well. Everybody has their place and time, and fire doesn't fit in that easily. That can upset it. So what you see in Europe particularly is that wildfire breaks out during times of social unrest, or when the social order breaks down. You can no longer hold it. So it sort of makes sense in a European context, but it does not make sense, say, in North American context or Australian context. You need a different conception of fire, which is to say your society has to be different to accommodate that.
That's very interesting, because we'd better befriend the fires instead of, being the enemy. And we can never be the master of it, apparently, over the past several centuries have proved that. And you also mentioned back in the 1960s and 1970s, the US actually wanted to sort of go into the direction of befriending the fires. But then that was 50 years ago. And has something changed within the system?
Well, it's very hard to change. And the population changed so that people are no longer, the early policies, many Americans were living in a rural environment and they were used to fire. So they had different attitudes than the elites, who were mostly urban and authorities, officials, professors, whatever. Our modern wildfire firefighting system evolved in 1910. There were huge fires, and we have a new agency, the U.S. Forest Service, that tries to cope with them. It is overrun by these fires, but traumatized by them, and then wants to put all fires out. So for 50 years, we tried to take all fires out, and then we see the consequences of that, and we spend the next 50 years trying to put good fire back in. Well, it turns out it's very hard to put it in once you've taken it out, because the environment changes. And so fire behaves differently in that environment. It's like trying to restore a lost species. You have to have the right habitat for it to survive. So it's very difficult. And then there are people who simply don't like fire. They don't want smoke. Agencies, the whole system, if you have a system that for its origins, for 5-6 decades of its origins, was committed to one purpose, taking fire out, it's very hard to change that culture. Suppose you had an urban fire service, and they say, well, we're going to let some of these buildings go, because in the end, it's kind of a renewal process, and people would be furious. And I can't imagine an urban fire service doing that. But that's in effect what the wildland, the countryside, the rural fire service wants to do.
Just to allow a piece of land to burn.
Not just letting it, doing it, or working with fire, so that it's still under control, but it's not just ours completely. We work with it. It's like herding sheep or driving cattle. We don't control the minds of all the sheep, but we can sort of direct them this way, that way. We can prevent them from coming so a mixed result. So you're working with the fire. It's not just an enemy. The two of you are working together in a sense, because this whole military metaphor for fire has been a horrible mistake. And because if you're in a war with fire, three things are going to happen. You're going to spend a lot of money, you're going to take a lot of casualties, and you're going to lose.
It's also very hard for me to imagine how to work with fire in practice. I mean, what steps do we need to take, and what kind of agencies in the governments we need, or what kind of other forces that we need to deploy to work with fire?
Well, you have to, you have to have social sanction. The society has to buy into it. You have to have political will. You need to have a legal system that will not punish people if some fires escape, because some inevitably will. We don't control the whole environment, but we're getting pretty good at doing this. There's a forest I can see part of outside my window, and for the last month, they have had this fire at the top of this large plateau, very rugged country, and they have been working with it very patiently, moving that fire, getting it down slope. So the fire wants to go up slope, so they're dragging it down. So when it burns up, it burns against itself, so that it's not, if they load the bottom, it would just blow up. So now they're starting at the top, and they're very patiently not pushing it, and they have natural barriers, and they're working, and then they burn out around that. So they drew an area that has some natural features or roads that they can use safely. And then they, knowing how fire will behave, work with that to have the fire burn this area out. And as a result, they will be protecting several small communities that would otherwise be vulnerable to a complete wildfire.
That's very interesting.
It's actually much more interesting than just charging in and trying to kill it.
Yeah, sending out helicopters and firefighters out there to try to tame it. But then I think it's also very hard for me to imagine, for example, California, with that amount of population and urban areas, to carry out an operation like this. And then I think this time also a lot of analysis has pointed out that the reason that the urban areas are suffering a lot in California this time is because of the expansion of urban spaces. And also, as you mentioned, the house structures are not designed or built fire safe. Why is that happening? California should have that in mind. They should have telling the residents, don't move into the fire-prone areas.
Los Angeles has grown large by growing. Its own growth is one of the major features of its economy. And selling houses, real estate is a huge business there. And so they don't want to do anything that will discourage people from moving in. They have a housing crisis. They don't have enough housing. Well, part of that is because we want to live in a certain kind of house. So there are all kinds of things that come into play. They are all choices. Now, Los Angeles is a basin, and it's surrounded, it has the ocean on one side and tall mountains around it. And the mountains that are on the side that connect to the city are treated basically like a city. You can't run engines up there, you can't do it, but you treat that as a full suppression, no choice. The other side of the mountains, they are doing this stuff. So it doesn't directly threaten these communities, but they have some area to work with, and they are working with these fires sometimes over weeks, even a couple of months, to do some good burning. And so it is possible if people choose to do it, but they have to want to do it, and they have to accept there's some cost to it in terms of money. There's some cost in terms of, you're going to have some smoke in the air for a while, not these hideous smoke palls. It's going to be annoying. You've got to accept that, but this is what will protect you and also help this environment survive the coming traumas of global warming and the changes that are coming.
What do you think the lessons should be learned this time? Because I think it's also inevitable that another mega fire, maybe bigger than this one, will explode sometime again in the future. And what should people do then?
Well, I don't know how big a trauma it takes, how big a fire it takes to shake the system enough that they are going to make really fundamental reforms. I understand completely what California's politicians are doing now. They want to get these people back in their houses as fast as they can. We will rebuild the houses. They'll rebuild them in the same lots, as quickly as we can, as painlessly, and that creates the same set of conditions that could occur again. But they may be willing to roll the dice and say, it won't happen in my lifetime, or the next time this comes, I'll be gone, or who knows what. But it's very hard. It's very hard to change fundamentally.
And I do want to check back on the role of climate change. I think it's quite clear what role climate change is playing right now. But how do you see climate change, the role of climate change in the future, in the Pyrocene?
We are sort of remaking the world with fire, both by the atmospheric changes, global warming, and also fires on the land, because what comes back is not going to be the same as what was there before. That's part of the climate will be different, so stuff will come back differently. What it comes back to, it will be better adjusted to its new circumstances, which is to say it will be more fire prone or more fire adapted. So gradually, just as we're driving off the ice, we will be driving off vegetation that is not ready to accommodate drought and fire and heat and those kinds of things. But I see us continually making a fire age. It is a metaphor. For me, it's a very helpful one. I suddenly it brings a lot of things together. Imagine an ice age, but for fire. So what would you predict the future to be? Well, more fire.
And is it going to be hotter? More heat?
More heat, in the atmosphere, so you're putting more energy into the system. So the stuff that's California already has well devised to promote fire, well, you're putting more energy into it, so the wet periods get wetter, the dry periods get drier, the frequency increases. Well, wet and dry is exactly what you want. That's the climatic basis for fire. It has to be wet enough to grow stuff and then dry enough to burn it. So in deserts burn after wet periods because now they have stuff to burn, and forests and temperate climates burn during dry periods because they have a lot of stuff, but it wasn't available to burn. Now it is. So those are going to be exaggerated. So what I see, little bits and pieces, a little bit all over, but bits and pieces gradually we'll be remaking it all.
Thank you, Professor Pyne. And I think your approach is very inspiring. And I think definitely pushing us to rethink our relationship with fires. But I guess it takes more time and more people and more practices for us to figure out, how to work with fire and how to have more good fires in the system.
I want to be optimistic. I mean, I have grandchildren. I have married grandchildren, for heaven's sakes, and I'm concerned about their future. But, we are the fire creature on this planet. We have a species monopoly on fire. Fire is what we do that no other creature does.
Yes, exactly.
This is our superpower, and we've misused it, and now we need to live up to our responsibilities with this power and begin using it to repair the damages we've done. So we have a long-standing relationship with fire. It should be possible for us to do it. This is what we do in the great chain of being. This is our job, and we're not doing it very well. We're greedy, we're abusive, we've created all kinds of problems, and what had been a tame companion has now gone feral. It just has gone wild, and that's all on us. But fire is what we do, so we should be able to do it. We should be able to handle this. I have to hope that, otherwise you don't do anything, and if you don't do anything, then the worst happens.
A huge thank you to Professor Stephen Pyne in Arizona for sharing his insights, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of Climate Watch. If you have any questions about climate change or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to check out my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Stay curious and stay hopeful.